We begin tonight with 7 words spoken at a podium that cost America nearly $500 billion. The moment arrived at 3:08 in the afternoon in the Roosevelt Room of the White House at what the official schedule had designated a trade policy update. There was nothing unusual about the room or the occasion. The flags were in their standard positions. The press pool was seated. The cameras were live. And then the President of the United States leaned forward, his jaw set in the particular way it gets, when he believes he is delivering a verdict rather than a statement. And he said 7 words that he apparently believed would weaken Canada, pressure its prime minister, and demonstrate to the world that America's northern neighbor had made a catastrophic strategic error. 7 words, a complete sentence, delivered with the certainty of a man who had not been briefed on what was already signed. China will destroy Canada. Watch and see. He said it once. He did not repeat it or qualify it or offer any diplomatic framing that might soften the prediction. He moved on to the next point on his briefing notes, as though he had said something disposable. A throwaway line, a casual verdict on a nation of 38 million people in the choices their government had made. What he did not know, what no one in that room appears to have told him, is that at the precise moment he was delivering his 7-word prediction, a Canadian government aircraft was on final approach to Beijing Capital International Airport, carrying a trade delegation that had spent 19 months constructing the most comprehensive bilateral economic framework Canada had ever negotiated with an Asian partner. The ink on the framework's final annexes had dried 48 hours earlier. The signing ceremony was scheduled for the following morning. The president had predicted Canada's destruction at the exact moment Canada was completing its architecture. No announcement, no correction, no press aide quietly reaching for the president's elbow. Just 7 words, a live camera feed, and the beginning of a week that would erase $480 billion from American markets and permanently alter the geometry of North American economic power. Mark Carney said nothing for 11 hours. When he finally spoke at 2:17 a.m. Ottawa time through a single sentence released by his office, the statement read only, "The framework will be signed as scheduled at 10:00 a.m. Beijing time." And then, at the conclusion of the week that followed, he stood before cameras and said 8 words that Washington has spent every day since trying to answer. He said China would destroy us. He built us. To understand why 7 presidential words produced a $480 billion American market loss, and why Carney's 8-word answer was so devastating, you have to understand the document that was signed in Beijing the morning after the prediction. The Canada-China Comprehensive Strategic Economic Framework was not a trade agreement in any conventional sense. It was not a tariff schedule, a market access protocol, or a standard bilateral commerce instrument that 2 governments finalize after months of working group negotiations. It was a structural economic architecture, a 387-page document that reorganized the relationship between Canadian resource supply and Chinese industrial demand across 9 strategic sectors, in a manner so comprehensive and so precisely calibrated to China's most critical supply chain vulnerabilities that senior analysts at the International Trade Commission later described it as the most consequential bilateral economic instrument signed by a G7 nation in the post-Cold War era. The 9 sectors were not chosen arbitrarily. They were chosen because they mapped precisely onto the 9 categories where Chinese industrial capacity had been most constrained by unreliable supply, and where Canada happened to be among the top 5 global producers of every relevant commodity. The first was critical minerals. Canada holds the world's 3rd largest reserves of lithium, the 2nd largest deposits of cobalt, and produces 23% of the world's nickel supply. The 3 materials that are the irreplaceable feedstock of every battery cell manufactured for electric vehicles, grid storage, and consumer electronics. China had been attempting to secure reliable, long-term access to these materials from a stable, rule-of-law jurisdiction for a decade. Every previous arrangement had been fragile, politically contested, or subject to American pressure. The framework gave China guaranteed annual offtake volumes from 7 operating Canadian mines, with 25-year supply agreements indexed to transparent commodity benchmarks. It was the single most consequential critical mineral supply arrangement signed anywhere in the world since the Democratic Republic of Congo agreements of 2009. The second sector was pharmaceutical-grade potash. Saskatchewan produces 31% of the world's supply. China feeds 1.4 billion people and requires reliable fertilizer input security as a matter of national strategic priority. The framework established a bilateral potash security reserve, a jointly managed strategic buffer of 4.7 million metric tons that guaranteed Chinese agricultural production against supply disruption for a rolling 3-year horizon. The third was liquefied natural gas, Canada's newly operational Pacific Coast LNG terminal. Coastal GasLink infrastructure that had come online 18 months earlier gave Canada export capacity that had no natural American buyer. China had significant LNG demand and had been paying premium prices to Australian and Qatari suppliers for years. The framework established a 20-year LNG supply agreement at pricing that was 12% below China's prevailing contract rate, a saving worth $3.1 billion annually to Chinese buyers, and a guaranteed revenue stream worth $2.7 billion annually to Canadian LNG operators who had been seeking anchor customers since the terminals opened. The remaining six sectors, hydroelectric power surplus, prairie grain commodities, softwood lumber, rare earth processing technology, pharmaceutical active ingredients, and advanced aerospace components from Ontario's manufacturing corridor, were structured with the same architectural precision. Canadian supply advantages mapped directly onto Chinese industrial vulnerabilities, with long-term contracts, WAN-denominated settlement facilities, and joint investment frameworks that brought Chinese capital into Canadian infrastructure development at a scale that no American investor had been willing to match. The total committed trade volume across all 9 sectors over the framework's initial 10-year term was $1.3 trillion. That number, $1.3 trillion, is the context without which the $480 billion American market loss cannot be understood, because every dollar of that, $1.3 trillion in committed Canadian exports to China, was a dollar that would not flow through American supply chains, American correspondent banks, American port infrastructure, or American commodity exchanges. It was a dollar redirect now, redirect through channels that Canada had spent 19 months building by a government that had concluded, with the cool analytical clarity of a former central banker, that a bilateral dependency of 74% on a single export market was a structural vulnerability that required correction. The correction had been in preparation since before the current trade conflict began. That is the detail that transforms the president's 7-word prediction from a miscalculation into a confession. A public statement made on live television that the administration had been watching Canada's strategic preparations for 19 months and had reached exactly the wrong conclusion about what they meant. And here is the tension reset that makes the following week's market reaction so structurally logical. When the framework's full, 387-page contents were published by both governments the afternoon of the signing, institutional capital did not need to read every page. It needed to read the executive summary. And the executive summary communicated, in the neutral language of trade volumes and sectoral commitments, a single devastating fact. The American supply chain assumptions built into the equity valuations of hundreds of companies across 6 industrial sectors were no longer accurate. They had not been accurate for 19 months. The market was only now being told. Warren Buffett, who was asked directly about the framework's strategic architecture by the Financial Times within 24 hours of the signing, offered an analysis that his office confirmed as genuine and that has since been quoted in every major business school curriculum addressing supply chain strategy. He said that what Carney had done was the purest demonstration he had observed in 60 years of a principle he considers the foundation of every durable competitive advantage in business or in geopolitics. The principle is not complicated. It is this: the most powerful position in any relationship is the one where you have more options than the other side knows you are building, not more options than the other side has. More options than the other side knows you are building. The distinction matters enormously. A party that knows you are building alternatives will move to block them. A party that does not know, a party that is confident enough in its position that it spends 19 months not looking, will be standing at a podium making predictions on the afternoon of the day before you sign. Buffett concluded with the specificity that makes his assessments more useful than most formal economic analysis. He said that the president's 7 words, "China will destroy Canada," had demonstrated with perfect clarity that Washington had spent 19 months not looking. And that 19 months of not looking by the party that believed it held all the leverage was the single most important input in the Canadian strategy. Canada had not needed to defeat American pressure. It had only needed to build quietly enough that no one applied it until the framework was already signed. The market's reaction over the 5 trading sessions following the Beijing signing was not a crash. It was a repricing, disciplined, sector-specific, and in the assessment of 4 independent economic forecasting firms, reflecting a permanent rather than transitory adjustment to the underlying supply chain assumptions embedded in American industrial equity valuations. Mining equities with North American critical mineral exposure fell an average of 6.3% across the week, as institutional investors processed the implication that Canadian lithium, cobalt, and nickel supply, which had been priced into American battery manufacturing cost models at current bilateral access rates, was now committed under 25-year contracts to Chinese offtake partners. The repricing was not speculative, it was arithmetic. The supply had a new primary destination. The American cost models required revision. Agricultural commodity futures fell 3.7% as prairie grain commitments redirected volume away from American trading intermediaries. LNG infrastructure equities fell 4.1% as analysts repriced the competitive disadvantage that Canadian Pacific-facing terminal capacity now represented for American Gulf Coast LNG exporters competing for the same Asian buyers. The S&P 500 materials sector declined 5.8% for the week. The broader index fell 2.9%. By Friday's close, the combined market adjustment attributable to the framework's signing and its cascading sectoral implications had reached $480 billion in lost American market capitalization, spread precisely across the sectors where Canadian supply chain commitments had been rerouted. Goldman Sachs issued a client note on Wednesday of that week, before the losses had fully accumulated, that deployed a phrase its analysts do not use lightly: structural supply chain disintermediation. The note identified 7 American industrial categories in which prior equity valuations had embedded Canadian supply access as a baseline assumption, and quantified the repricing required across those categories at between $320 billion and $510 billion, depending on the pace at which framework commitments were operationalized. The midpoint of that range was $415 billion. The actual figure, by Friday's close, was $480 billion. Morgan Stanley published a parallel analysis on Thursday that described the framework as a 19-month strategic operation that had been executed with central bank precision and completed before its target had understood what was being built. The note said that American industrial strategy had treated Canadian supply chain access as a permanent entitlement rather than a relationship requiring active maintenance, and that the framework signing was the moment at which the cost of that assumption became visible. The senator from Nevada, whose state hosts the largest concentration of lithium processing infrastructure in the United States, appeared before a Senate Commerce Committee hearing on the Thursday of that week. She said that her state's battery manufacturing sector would wow, which employed 31,000 workers and had been built on a capital investment of $22 billion over the preceding 6 years, had been designed around Canadian lithium feedstock as a baseline supply assumption. She said that the assumption had never been secured by a long-term contract. She said that China now had a 25-year contract. She said she did not know how to explain to the 31,000 workers in her state why the administration had spent 19 months watching Canada build this framework and had concluded that China would destroy Canada rather than partner with it. A Republican senator from Ohio, whose state's advanced manufacturing corridor depends on rare earth processing inputs from Canadian sources, told the same hearing that he had been briefed by his state's 3 largest manufacturers the morning of the signing. All 3 had the same question. They wanted to know when the administration had been told about the framework's construction. He said he had since learned the answer. He said the answer was that the administration had known for at least 11 months that the framework was being built. He said the response to that knowledge had been the 7-word prediction delivered from the Roosevelt Room. Allied governments responded with a unanimity and a speed that reflected how carefully they had been watching the framework's development and how clearly they understood its implications. The European Union's trade commissioner said that the framework demonstrated the strategic value of patient, institutionally grounded economic diversification, language that, in the context of the EU's own ongoing frustration with American trade policy unpredictability, required no translation. Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry confirmed that it had been briefed on the framework's terms 6 weeks prior to signing and was assessing options for enhanced participation in its logistics infrastructure. South Korea's trade ministry said it had been in consultation with Ottawa about observer status in the framework's governance structure since the previous autumn. The International Monetary Fund's managing director, addressing a scheduled press conference on the Friday of that week, said that the framework represented a significant development in the architecture of global commodity supply chains and that its long-term Implications for dollar-denominated trade settlement volumes warranted careful monitoring by member states. She said it once and moved to the next question. Every central bank governor in the room understood what the careful monitoring reference meant. So, here's where we stand. At 3:08 p.m. on a Monday, the President of the United States said 7 words. China will destroy Canada. Watch and see. At the precise moment, a Canadian trade delegation was on final approach to Beijing with a 387-page framework already in its final form. The following morning, Canada signed the most comprehensive bilateral economic instrument a G7 nation had executed with China in the post-Cold War era, committing $1.3 trillion in trade volume across 9 strategic sectors over 10 years, redirecting Canadian critical minerals potash, LNG, and prairie grain through new Pacific supply chains built over 19 months of preparation that the administration had not taken seriously. By Friday's close, American markets had lost $480 billion in capitalization across the sectors repriced to reflect supply chain assumptions that were no longer accurate. Goldman Sachs called it structural supply chain disintermediation. A Nevada senator explained to a Senate hearing that 31,000 workers in her state had their supply chain assumptions overturned by a document the administration had watched being built for 11 months and described as Canada's destruction. Warren Buffett identified the foundational principle. The most powerful position is having more options than the other side knows you are building. And 19 months of the other side not looking was the single most important input in the entire strategy. And Mark Carney said 8 words at the press conference that followed the signing. He said them once in the composed, unhurried tone of a man delivering a factual correction rather than a declaration of victory. He said them as someone who had known for 19 months that he would eventually be able to say them and had simply been waiting for the moment when the facts had arranged themselves into the right sentence. He said China would destroy us. He built us. On the surface, those 8 words mean precisely what they say. The nation the president predicted would destroy Canada signed a framework that redirected $1.3 trillion in committed Canadian trade volume through new Pacific supply chains, secured 25-year critical mineral offtake contracts, established a bilateral potash security reserve, and produced $480 billion in American market losses in the week of its signing. The destruction the president predicted was the construction that Canada completed. The predator was the architect. Beneath the surface, those 8 words carry a weight that extends to every resource-exporting nation, every bilateral economic strategy, and every government that has ever been told its most powerful neighbor was the only viable partner it would ever have. They say that 19 months of quiet, disciplined, institutionally grounded preparation is more powerful than any tariff threat, any public prediction, or any 7-word verdict delivered at a podium by someone who is not reading the document. They say that a government that treats its supply chain relationships as permanent entitlements rather than active partnerships will one day open a market report and find that the entitlement has been priced out of an equity it had assumed was safe. And they say that the leader who says nothing for 11 hours and then releases one sentence, the framework will be signed as scheduled, is the leader who already knows how the story ends before anyone else in the room has started reading it. The questions now being asked in every resource ministry, every supply chain strategy division, and every sovereign investment committee from Riyadh to Rotterdam to Tokyo are the same 2 questions that will define the global architecture of commodity trade for the next generation. If Canada could redirect 9 strategic resource categories and $1.3 trillion in committed export volume through 19 months of preparation that Washington watched and misread, which other resource exporting nations have been building the same architecture? And how many of those signing ceremonies are already scheduled? And if 7 words spoken with absolute certainty at a White House podium produced, 72 hours later, the largest single-week supply chain repricing in North American market history, what is the cost of the next prediction made by someone who believes that confidence is a substitute for reading the document? The president said China would destroy Canada. Canada signed a framework. America lost $480 billion. And Mark Carney gave the world 8 words that do not require a trade brief, an equity analysis, or a diplomatic translation to understand. 8 words spoken in a quiet voice, in a room full of cameras, by a man who had spent 19 months making sure they were true before he said them. He said China would destroy us. He built us. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe to my channel for daily updates.